Legacy is a format in Magic where you can use pretty much every card that's ever been printed, except some cards that are banned. So in this series, we'll be going over all the cards in the Legacy ban list and explain why they're banned and if they can come off the ban list. To start off, we're going to go over a group of cards called the Power 9, a set of the 9 strongest cards ever printed in the first set of Magic, and still some of the best cards in the entire game, as well as a few cards that are very similar to the Power 9. Starting us off, we have the Moxen, namely Mox Pearl, Mox Sapphire, Mox Jet, Mox Ruby, and Mox Emerald. This is a cycle of cards that are all 0 mana and each tap for one of the 5 colors of Magic. These cards, like the rest of the Power 9, were restricted in the very first banned and restricted announcement all the way back in 1994, where they were restricted in the entire game as there weren't different formats of Magic at the time. The Power 9 stayed on the vintage restricted list for the rest of the game's history and were grandfathered onto the Legacy ban list when the format was created. Why were the Moxen banned? The simple answer is that they're a mana positive card with absolutely no downside at all that permanently ramps you, which is obviously too strong. Getting a little more in depth with it, if you think about it, Moxen are basically just lands. They tap for a mana every turn and cost no mana to play. However, unlike lands, there isn't any restriction to how many Moxen you can play on a single turn. This means that they're basically strictly better lands. The only downside, if you can call it one, is that they're more vulnerable to removal, as destroying artifacts is easier than destroying lands, but this isn't really that relevant. Now, this would pretty obviously be a problem on its own, as no deck would turn down playing a card this powerful, making them extremely generic staples that literally every deck would play. However, this is only the first issue. The bigger issue is how they affect the way the game plays. Having this much mana on turn 1 can basically allow you to set up incredibly powerful plays. Legacy already has tons of decks that can kill you on turn 1, but these cards would increase the number of these decks substantially, making their turn 1 kills even more consistent and making them far harder to interact with. To put this into perspective, cards like Mox Diamond and Chrome Mox, Moxen that require to discard a land or exile a non-land, non-artifact card from your hand in order to use them respectively, still see a ton of play in the format despite their downsides. However, the issues don't stop there. Even if you're playing a fair matchup, the extra mana can make it basically impossible to win the game. If one player starts with 3 lands in their hand and the other starts with 3 Moxen in their hand, the player with the Moxens will often just win the game by default. Having 3 mana on your first turn and being able to carry that into the future is far, far stronger than having to play 1 land a turn and slowly wait to get your mana up. This means that the Moxen player will be making more plays and making stronger plays. It'll be nearly impossible for the player who only drew lands to come back. This is why the Moxen need to be banned. They're useful in literally every deck, and in a format as fast and as strong as Legacy, they create a lot of non-games. Even though they do technically benefit every deck equally, they make the format as a whole a lot worse if they came back. Could the Moxen be unbanned? No, they're still too good. If you want a swingy, more powerful version of Magic with all the Magic's most busted cards, Vintage exists, and the Moxen are still restricted to 1 copy there. Unbanning them in Legacy would be unnecessary because there's a format for cards like the Moxen already, not to mention that having 4 copies of Mox in your deck leads to far more busted starts at non-games than being restricted to 1 copy does. How could the Moxen be fixed to be unbanned? As I mentioned earlier, we already have fixed Moxen. Chrome Mox and Mox Diamond are still very strong cards, but the cost of losing 1 card from your hand is real enough to make them fair play in Legacy. Up next, we have Black Lotus, one of the most iconic cards in all of Magic. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 0, and the ability where you can tap it and sacrifice it to add 3 mana of any 1 color. Why was Black Lotus banned? The simple answer is that it makes way too many strong and powerful combos, and improves the combos already legal way too much. As I mentioned with Moxen, hitting specific mana thresholds is really important for combo decks. That can let them play their important cards like Ad Nauseam way earlier, as early as turn 1 with the right hands. To illustrate how busted this card is, let's take a look at Lotus Petal and Lion's Eye Diamond, cards that were attempts at fixing the Lotus's busted effect. Petal is the exact same as Lotus, but it only adds a paltry 1 mana, and Lion's Eye Diamond is the exact same as Lotus, except it can only be activated at instant speed, meaning it can't be activated while paying for a spell, and it has the additional cost where you have to discard your entire hand. Despite how much worse both of these cards are than Lotus, combo decks have been relying on them for years to help power out their combos earlier. People have found tons of combos to try and make LED basically be a Lotus, and they found tons of ways to make the card incredibly strong. People will do things like cast a draw spell and crack their diamond in response, and just hope they draw the cards they need to combo off, because getting 3 free mana for 1 card is simply that powerful. Could Black Lotus be unbanned? No, the card is simply too powerful in the right decks. Unbanning Lotus wouldn't be quite as bad as unbanning the Moxen, mostly because the damage would be restricted to 1 archetype of deck, but it would make combo decks far too strong. How could Black Lotus be fixed to be unbanned? Like with Moxen, we essentially already have fixed version in Lotus Petal and Lion's Eye Diamond, and there aren't that many other ways you can fix the card. Next up, we have Soul Ring and Mana Crypt. Soul Ring is an artifact with a mana cost of 1 and the ability where you can tap to add 2 colorless mana. Mana Crypt is an artifact with a mana cost of 0 and the ability where you can tap it to add 2 colorless, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you flip a coin, and if you lose the coin flip, Mana Crypt deals 3 damage to you. Mana Crypt was banned in September of 1999, and Soul Ring was restricted on the first list in 1994 with the power 9, and that ban has also carried on into Legacy. Now, why were these cards banned? These cards were banned for a very similar reason to the Moxen, though the fact they produce colorless mana makes them a bit harder to use in a lot of circumstances. Producing this much mana for so little investment lets you power out tons of combos way faster, and lets you pull further ahead each turn in a fair matchup. In fact, since they make 2 mana instead of 1, in a lot of decks, these are actually better than the Moxen. For example, one deck that could use these cards would be a deck that plays soul lands like City of Traders and Ancient Tomb. Lands that tap for 2 mana, and then use these cards to slam powerful stacks pieces like Chalice of the Void and Lodgestone Golem into play on turn 1. Combining this with the artifact synergies like Mystic Forge, and you have a deck that's extremely powerful. In fact, this is the basis of a deck called Shops in Vintage, though the eponymous Mistra's Workshop is banned in Legacy, so it won't be able to be played exactly the same way here. Basically, these cards are just extra Moxen that are better in some circumstances and worse in others, though on average, they're often better. For example, in the fan format Canadian Highlander, there's a point system where cards have a specific point value assigned to them, and you can only have 10 points of a card in your deck. In that format, Moxen are pointed at 3, and Soul Ring and Mana Crypt are pointed at 4. Now, there are some additional differences, as Canadian Highlander is a singleton format, but still, it's worth noting that there are contexts where these cards are considered more powerful than even the Moxen. Could these cards be unbanned? No, they're still way too strong. They do everything the Moxen can do, and often more. How could these cards be fixed to be unbanned? Really, this kind of fast mana is just too powerful. There's not really a fix besides building with the mana cost of a more reasonable amount of mana. Next up, we have Ancestral Recall. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 blue, and it has the effect where target player draws 3 cards. This card was also restricted in the very first ban list. Why was Ancestral Recall banned? Drawing 3 cards is a very strong effect, and this is simply far too little mana for it. Generally, this cost is around 4 mana. And there are some versions of this effect at 3 mana, but 1 mana is absolutely unheard of. This much card advantage is really hard to beat, especially with cards like Force of Will being staples in the format. Force's downside of having to go -1 to counter a spell for free has never stopped it from being a format-defining staple in Legacy. And being able to recoup all that card advantage and get even more in the process is extremely strong. Now, the reason being so low mana costing is such a big deal, despite there being other draw spells in the format that can draw a similar number of cards, is that it means you don't really have to slow down to play the card. Normally you have to give up tempo to play a draw spell, giving your opponent a chance to act without you having mana. However, because Recall is so cheap, you can just cast it without ever losing a hole in your defense. Or spam it to just find the right card you need whenever you want and basically lose nothing. With this card legal, there's basically no reason to play any other color besides blue. Blue decks could easily counter anything relevant your opponent did and draw so many cards that they'd never be able to come back. Legacy already has a very blue-heavy metagame, but this would make playing a non-blue deck a complete non-option. Could Ancestral Recall be unbanned? No. Blue is already too strong, and this would lead to it being the best color by a mile, as well as make it so that there were tons of non-games where one player drew a few recalls and forces and proceeded to completely snowball into winning, with basically no way for their opponent to do anything. How could Recall be fixed to be unbanned? Pretty much every way there is to fix this card has already been tried. 1 blue draw spells like Ponder, Preordain, and Consider basically fulfill the same role as Recall, just at a level that's far closer to being fair. So a fixed version of Recall basically already exists. Next up, we have Time Walk. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue, and it has the effect where you take an extra turn after this one. Like the rest of the Power 9, this card was restricted in the first ban and restricted announcement in 1994. Why was Time Walk banned? This card is similar to Recall, where it simply has far too strong of an effect for far too small of a mana cost. The cheapest take an extra turn cards are priced at 5 mana, such as Time Warp, which is over twice the cost of Walk. Time Warp has seen a fair amount of play in decks over the years, though not in formats like Legacy. Now, taking an extra turn is a very strong effect, but it's usually not quite as good as it looks. The thing is, all playing a take an extra turn spell does on its own is let you play another land, untap all your lands, and draw a card to replace itself. This isn't quite strong enough to actually be good. However, they're extremely powerful with another card in play. If you have a creature on field that can let you attack and then untap to attack again, or if you can play another creature on that turn, it allows it to attack next turn, sort of giving the card haste, as it won't be summoning sick on your next turn. If you have any planeswalkers, it lets you use their loyalty abilities all over again. I'm bringing all this up because the lower the mana cost of an extra turn spell, the more likely you can make use of these effects. A lot of the time, you'll only have 3 or so damage on board, so paying 5 mana to attack again won't be quite worth it. However, paying 2 mana is a lot more manageable, and will be far more useful, far more often. Finally, the thing that really makes this card insane, outside of how powerful it can be in the right circumstances, and the fact that it's very easy to make the card strong compared to other similar cards, is how low the floor is. The floor of this card is how good it is in the worst circumstances. And in the worst circumstances, when you cast Walk, you get all your mana back and can play an extra land and get to draw a card to replace it. It's basically a better Explorer in that circumstance. This is what makes it in effect so broken. A lot of the time, it's just good. It's a free cycle that allows you to develop your mana base more. However, sometimes it's just straight up winning you the game. Both the floor and ceiling, or how good the card is in the best circumstances, are just way too high. Could Time Walk be unbanned? Absolutely not. This card does everything bad that all the cards I've mentioned before do. It makes blue way too strong, and it leads to too many non-games. The card is still way too good. How could Time Walk fix to be unbanned? Besides increasing the mana cost, there are ways to fix the card. There's a card called Seed Time, which is I take an extra turn spell for 1 and 1 green, the same mana value as Walk, but it has a restriction where you only get to take an extra turn if your opponent casts a blue spell this turn. By adding a similar heavy restriction to Walk, you could make it bad enough that would be okay to unban. And finally, we have Timetwister and Wheel of Fortune. Timetwister is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 and 1 blue, and the effect where both players shuffle their hand and graveyard into the library and then draw 7 cards. Wheel of Fortune has the effect where each player discards their hand and then draws 7 cards. Timetwister was hit on the very first ban restricted announcement, but Wheel survived a bit longer, getting banned just a few months later in March of 1994. Why were these cards banned? Similar to Recall, these cards draw you too many cards for way too little mana. While they do give your opponent's cards too, the fact that you got to use this card first made them extremely powerful. 3 mana to draw a new hand of 7 cards is very strong, especially when your deck is full of fast mana cards like Lotus Petal and Chrome Mox, or back in the day, the other members of the power like Black Lotus and the original Moxen. This would let you do things like play out your hand, cast one of these wheels to refill your hand, then play even more fast mana cards. Then you might have the mana for another wheel or draw effect to continue comboing off. Currently, there are decks that function the similar way in Legacy, using Lion's Eye Diamond and a new version of Timetwister, Echo of Eons, which has the same effect but costs 4 and 2 blue, but has a flashback cost of 2 and 1 blue, which means you can cast it from your graveyard, but you have to exile it afterwards. With these 2 cards, you can cast LED and then crack it for mana, discarding your Echo. Now that it's in your graveyard, you can cast it for its flashback cost, meaning that it's basically just Black Lotus and Twister, just with some additional restriction. This deck then uses cards like the previously mentioned fast mana and extra draw spells to cast a bunch of cards, before finally ending off with Tendrils of Agony. This is a spell with Storm, meaning when you cast it, you get an extra copy for each other spell you cast this turn, and it has the effect where target opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. Since you'll be casting a bunch of ramp spells and draw spells before it, you'll easily be able to cast at least 9 other spells before Tendrils, making it drain your opponent for lethal. Both Twister and Wheel can do the same thing, but even better under some circumstances. However, there are a few other applications. There are cards like Narset, Partner of Veils, and Hull Preacher, which make it so that your opponent can't draw more than 1 card, or draw a card outside of their draw step. By combining these cards with Wheel, you get to make your opponent discard their entire hand while refilling your own, which basically wins you the game right there. Right now, decks are using Days Undoing, a version of Timetwister that ends your turn when you use it, getting rid of the upside where you get to use the cards first to pull this combo off. All in all, there are just too many ways to abuse these cards. Could Timetwister and Wheel of Fortune be unbanned? This is another no, but it's far closer than any card we've talked about today. The thing is, these cards wouldn't necessarily be that crazy in combo decks given the current format. Remember, decks already have access to Echo of Eons, and with LED, the card usually works better in those decks than these wheels do, since cards like Black Lotus aren't currently legal. Really, the scary decks of these cards would be the fair decks in the format and the decks that can combine it with draw lock cards. This is far closer to being able to be unbanned, but they're still too good at the end of the day. How could these cards be fixed to be unbanned? Like all the cards we've talked about, there are a few fixed versions of these cards. Echo of Eons and Days Undoing are good attempts at fixing the cards. There's also the versions that cost extra mana, like Time Reversal, and these cards are perfectly fine as well. Alright, and that's the video. Do you have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, we'd love to hear about them down in the comments.